Welcome to the Generative AI Innovation Incubator Spotlight Session on Medicine and Public Health, taking place during the second hackathon of our series. The first one was last weekend in Education and the Future of Work. And you can check out the website to see the projects that were produced. We're going to have some previews here. Okay, so you can see here is the URL for the website, and I will paste that into the chat. Please also feel free to tweet about this session and use the hashtag #GAI3. Okay, I am doing the opening and I am just about to move on to the exciting part. Our teams, 4 out of 5 of our hackathon teams, will each be giving a 3-minute presentation about their work. And you'll be able to see the kind of work that's going on. Tomorrow, there will be a judging session, a public judging session beginning at 1 p.m. In a separate link, which you received when you also got the announcement about this session. So if you would like to come and weigh in on the judging and see the final presentations, please come to Zoom tomorrow at 1 p.m. In addition to seeing our teams, we have 2 guest speakers here from Carnegie Mellon. One, Robert Murphy, who will be talking about AI and computational biology, and Ari Lightman, who will be talking about AI healthcare and the Center for Machine Learning and Health. And we're very excited to hear about some of the cutting edge AI work going on right here at Carnegie Mellon. Okay, so this is just to let you know what to expect tomorrow. If you come to our judging event, we'll have a short welcome. Then we'll have the teams each present. They'll each present for 5 minutes with 3 minutes for questions and answers. And then what will happen is that there will be a deliberation session where we will consider the public vote, and some experts will weigh in, and finally a decision will be made, and then we'll come back and announce the winner. So you won't want to miss that. Please do come back for that. And with that, we will begin now for hearing our teams. And the first team who will be presenting is Health Advisor. So I will stop sharing my screen. Health Advisor, please go ahead and share your screen and go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Carolyn. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. So our team is Health Advisors, members including myself, Anshul, Edward, Shifali, and Sonesh. Second, as I get these slides moving.
Try clicking in a different part of your screen.
There you go. Yeah, so we're building a personalized AI well-being advisor, providing advice for the general population with a focus on mental health insights. Mental health is one of the biggest public health concerns in the world today, with the conditions like depression, anxiety, stress-related disorders becoming prevalent. For example, as per studies, 50% of postgraduate students have shown some signs of depression at some point of time. Most people know someone who has had some form of severe mental health depression. For example, one of my close family members suffered from severe mental health depression during the beginning of the COVID pandemic. Personalized healthcare advice is costly and requires access to human experts. So our solution is to provide personalized and actionable plans based on individual context, augmented through knowledge of physiological states, behavior, personal profile, and health goals, enabled through wearable devices like Apple Watch, Fitbit that are increasingly prevalent, and using generation AI to generate these plans. So during the opening keynote of the Gen AI Incubator, there was a discussion between Tom Mitchell and Carolyn Rose. LLM models are only trained on text. They are not multimodal models, lacking complete context. So to make Gen AI more and more relevant, building that context would become important. So we are taking a baby step in that direction for our targeted use cases. Along with physiological data, we collect personal data from the user's demographic, medical history, activity levels, and their health goals to augment context and provide actionable recommendations to improve their mental health and achieve their wellness goals, examples, sleep, motivation. Insights could be examples like you see on the screen, connect to community, set up a doctor's appointment. And we will support a conversational interface for follow-up questions and providing more detailed recommendations after the initial intervention, enabling the user to take action. Our hypothesis being that these Gen AI-based personalized plans can outperform human-generated one-size-fits-all solutions based on predefined best practices. All right. So yeah, so these are our results so far. So as you can see on the screen, we have done some preliminary prompt testing with ChatGPT, which has given good results. And we have experimented with Llama 2. So currently we are at GPT 3.5, but because of widely available documentation, ease of use for GPT 3.5, we will require some more time for Llama 2 tuning. So if we have time at the end of the hackathon, we might switch back to Llama 2. Other planned experiments are enriching our knowledge base by other external data sources, which the model might not have been trained on, and avoiding bias by using a different model for quality safety analysis.
Thank you so much, Anshul.
Thank
you so much. We have to move on now to the next team. Thank you. So Med AI, you are our next team.
Yay. Okay, Med AI. Hi, everybody. We are Med AI. This is the team. In the team, we have a doctor, ML engineer, and software engineer. So as you know, more than 50% of the physicians and nurses suffer burnout, and it's huge across the industry. When you're speaking with many of them, 60% says the burnout is related to the inbox messages, data entry. It's tedious admission work that we are having to the work. And that has a huge impact on the physician and on patient. Physician, their interpersonal relationship deteriorate. There is a rise of the medical error. There's a high risk of the malpractice. The patient are dissatisfied, and ultimately the patient outcome goes bad. Now the question, how do we know it? I live it. I see my wife coming home late, missing the dinner, glued to the computer, trying to read the result from the patient lab result, responding to the patient's email, and she's suffering. And my relationship is suffering too. So what we're going to do, we are trying to create an agents that enable the physician, help the physician with some of this administration work. Obviously, this admin work, there are a lot of them. There are tons of them. There is an inbox, there is a summary, creating the note. We can attack all of them, particularly through the generative AI as where we are today. So what we did, we started looking at the inbox. When even looking at the inbox, there is a different type of the messages they are getting. They're getting messages from the patient. They're getting messages from the physician. They're getting the result that they are having to review and respond to the patient. We start focusing on the result. The reason we start focusing on the result was two. Number one, available data. We are able to use the data to train our model. Number two, high impact. The most number of the messages that they're getting based on the conversation that we had with some of the physicians was through this lab result that they have to read it, evaluate them, respond to the patients. Let me walk you through what it means. When the physician gets a lab result at the point time t, doesn't mean anything. They have to look at the previous lab. For example, if I go to the doctor today, I do a blood test, blood pressure, my blood pressure is 53. It's abnormal compared to everybody else. But the doctor, they have to dig in, read my background on the medical record, looking at my previous lab to make a decision that is normal for me. The same thing with any other doctor. When they get this lab result, if it's abnormal, doesn't mean the particular organ is not functioning. They have to gather lots of information and evaluate that one. That's where we are coming into place. We are trying to enable the physician to be more efficient. Rather than they have to go collect all of this one, summarize everything for themselves, we are enabling, we are leveraging generative AI to go over there and gather relative information regarding that lab and summarize it and give it to the physician that they can read it and potentially act on it. We are just doing all the way to the summary. We like as a next step, potentially make a draft that they are able to respond directly to the patient. But right now, what we are doing for this hackathon, we are focusing on finding relative information, creating a prompt that the physician is able to communicate with the system, gather, receive a summary of the specific information. Our goal is to improve the quality of the. Okay.
I'm going to have to cut you off. Your time is up.
That's
but
okay.
Thanks so much. It sounds great. Okay.
Thank you.
Please stop sharing your screen. And the next group is Protein Architects. We can't hear you, Protein Architects. Are you there?
Yep, we're ready.
Okay, great. Go right ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we gather with a shared goal to speed up the journey towards the cure for Alzheimer's disease. Before we get into it, let us pause and acknowledge the gravity of the situation. Alzheimer's disease is one of the most pressing challenges in modern healthcare, with its negative impact felt not only by those afflicted, but also by their families and loved ones. As of 2021, the number of Americans living with Alzheimer's disease has crossed over 6 million, with over 11 million Americans providing unpaid care for them. This cost the nation over $500 billion in associated expenses. The quest for a cure holds universal significance in alleviating its adverse impact on individuals and families. Firstly, what is Alzheimer's disease? The onset of Alzheimer's is linked with the abnormal buildup of tau proteins in the brain. However, in the brain of a person affected by Alzheimer's, tau proteins begin to aggregate, forming hyperphosphorylated tau proteins inside the neurons, also referred to as tau protein tangles. This disrupts nutrient transport, causing cell death and contributing to the cognitive decline we see in patients. So, what is our goal? We aim to generate candidate peptide sequences with a specific ability to selectively inhibit tau protein tangles. These sequences have the potential to neutralize the detrimental effects of tau protein tangles, leading to a reduction in the adverse impact on patients.
So why generative AI? As many of you might know, that drug discovery is one of the most complex and lengthy areas of human development. Just look at the average length and the average cost to get a drug to the market. It takes more than a decade to get a drug to the market. And as of now, there are truly very few novel drugs on the market. In 2020, the FDA approved 53 novel drugs, and that was the record year till now. Next slide. So what are the connections between protein science and human language? You can think of letters as amino acids and words as peptides and sentences as proteins. Next slide. So Protein Architect's goal is to implement a user-friendly interface or pipeline to accelerate AI-powered drug discovery for Alzheimer's disease. So with our interface, researchers and developers can use the power of Gen AI models to accelerate the creation of new drug candidates for Alzheimer's disease. You might be wondering about the potential safety concerns of our project. So we will be implementing data quality checks to ensure that the training data used for our models are accurate, reliable, and also free from biases. We are also going to thoroughly validate and evaluate the performance of our trained models before we deploy them on our platform. So we are also planning to incorporate a review and approval process by our domain experts for any generated sequences or predictions that might require human validation. And we'll also encourage them to provide feedback on the generated sequences and predictions. So in conclusion, with our efforts in the hackathon, we hope to pave the way to a future where protein language models can speed up the production of life-saving therapies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, and last but not least, we will hear from Spiritual Engine. And that's only last but not least for the projects, and then we have our 2 invited talks, of course.
Carolyn, am I visible? Is my screen visible?
Yes, it's all good. All right, go ahead and get started.
Sorry about that. So welcome everybody, and thank you for being here for the talk. So our project is, as the slide says, using AI to leverage the spiritual wisdom of the world and present it to individuals who are interested in it. So what is a need? We feel that there is a significant rise in intolerance in society, and this could be because of misunderstandings in the spiritual traditions. And these are some examples that we have listed down. And this is not something new. People from a very long time back as well, they have felt the same sentiments that there is a need for a better understanding, and that can lead to lead us closer to world peace. So this is our team, Anjali Sharma, Aditi, and myself. And what we are suggesting is a spiritual coach, which draws upon all the spiritual traditions and philosophies of the world and helps people answer questions that they may have, for which they may not have a ready answer or a clear answer. And I think that these human conditions, they have persisted across time. They are eternal questions, and people always struggle with them. And this wisdom of some of the finest people of the times is available, but probably there's a need to present it to people in a suitable way. So what we are suggesting is that people can select the different spiritual traditions that they want to tap into, and they can ask questions. So this is, for example, in a university setting, this could be a question that a student might have. And these are some of the results we have gotten from OpenAI, for example. Just to kind of give you a sense of two of the religions that we put together here for better readability, there is a slight difference, and people can see the differences, and they can distill the knowledge that is most suitable for them. They can sense make what makes sense for them for that particular situation. And we feel that there is tremendous amount of wisdom available in all these spiritual texts, and as well as philosophies, which can help people answer the questions that we see people struggling with from the rise in mental health issues. So some of the next steps that we are working towards is we don't want to just bank upon OpenAI, which is the LLM that we're using, but we also want to feed in the spiritual and the philosophical text data. And this kind of gives you a sense for how we are envisioning it. Of course, there is this challenge of misrepresentation or even inaccurate information coming in. So we are hoping to tap into university professors who study these subjects and have a board of those advisors who can help them to put some of the guardrails. So yeah, that is our plan of action, and that is what we're working towards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we have heard from all of our teams, and that is just a sneak peek at the work that's going on in the hackathon. There's also one additional team that was not able to be here at this event, but is very much competing and will be presenting tomorrow. So tomorrow at 1 p.m. is our final judging event. Again, see your email for the Zoom link. And now we will have two invited talks. Our first talk is by Bob Murphy from our Computational Biology Department. Take it away, Bob. And you are muted.
1 second. Okay, thanks, Carolyn, for the invitation to talk with your group. Now for something a little different, in that what I'm going to be talking about is what many of us are beginning to see as the future of science, as a combination of generative modeling, AI, and laboratory automation driven by AI, and especially driven by what's referred to as active machine learning, which is different from, for those of you who are familiar with reinforcement learning, it is often confused between active machine learning and reinforcement learning. Just to clarify that before we get started, reinforcement learning is about learning policies about how that you can use to solve similar problems in the future. And active machine learning is about driving data acquisition in order to produce an accurate model for a particular problem in a particular instance. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. So let's start a while ago, and we're going to build off of what you probably all learned in high school or perhaps in college about the history of biology and about biology itself. For hundreds of years, biology was focused on describing things, describing how many organisms there are, what their properties were, how they behaved. And then in the 1900s, that science shifted from these kind of descriptive studies to mechanistic studies, trying to understand how biological organisms, do the things that they do. And that was driven by what's called a reductionist approach, which is to take things apart and then try to understand each of the pieces. And the assumption was that if we understood how each of the pieces worked, we would be able to understand how organisms work, like ourselves. And this is a little bit like when my dad was a kid. His dad brought a car home that didn't work, and he said, if you fix it, you can drive it. And he took the whole car apart, figured out how each of the pieces worked, figured out what was broken, put it all back together, and could drive it. And so that was the driving approach in the 1900s for how to approach biology. And this was quite successful. A lot of things, sort of general principles of biology were learned. DNA structure, genetic code of how amino acids are coded by nucleic acids, organelles, a ton of things were learned about the basics of biology. And that was translated, and the things that were learned were translated into what were thought to be biological laws. So for example, DNA makes RNA makes protein. The so-called central dogma of biology was a law. Another law was protein sequence determines structure, determines function. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that were being learned especially during the 50s and 60s. However, by the 70s, things started to fall apart. A lot of phenomena were discovered. For me, the most telling was the discovery of reverse transcriptase, which can take RNA and make DNA out of it, and horizontal gene transfer, which allows genes to go from one organism to another, which was something you wouldn't have allowed. So there were lots and lots of exceptions that were discovered, such that we no longer really had the concept of a biological law. It started to get very weak. And in combination with that, studies of how many pieces, how many genes, or how many proteins were involved in a particular behavior or a particular system within organisms, humans, found that many pieces were interacting with each other for even relatively simple behaviors. And when you put those two things together, what became clear was that the reductionist approach of taking things apart and trying to figure out what this one thing does by itself wasn't going to work in this case where you had so many things all working together. And that, was a major realization. And that led to what is called systems biology. And that's been underway for the last 2 or 3 decades. And the idea was that we recognized that biological systems, even as down to the level of cells, are complex systems, a term from engineering that describes something where the behavior of the whole cannot be inferred from the behaviors of the individual pieces, okay? And what that means is if you can't figure out what each piece is doing in such a way that you can predict the behavior of the whole, then you need to study the system as a whole. and learn how the system changes in response to changes of the individual components. But we already said there are lots and lots and lots of components that interact in complex ways. And so in order to really have an understanding of a biological system, we would need to be able to know how the behavior of the system would change with changes in any of the components in any combination. And there are just too many combinations to do that. So that systems biology paradigm then was built on the idea, well, let's do a large set of experiments, not all of the experiments, and try to build a predictive model for the results of all the other experiments. And the approach there was do a big block of experiments and then build a big model. And then the question is, well, is that model any good? And so the emphasis in systems biology typically is on validating the model by doing additional experiments. So the idea is, you have this set, you collect some data, build the model, and then you validate the model, and then you use them, make further predictions from the model. The problem with that is that whole idea, the idea that what you're learning is biological knowledge. What's the form of that? That's rules, but there aren't any rules. And so this idea that what you get out of this is learning principles, that fails. And the other thing that fails is empirical models can't be proven. That it's, people would say, well, I validated the model by making some additional predictions, and those predictions were right. So I validated the model, but validation is a synonym for prove, and you can't prove an empirical model. So what is that? Where does that leave us in biology? That's where active learning comes in. Instead of doing additional experiments in order to prove a model, which you can't do, the goal is to continuously improve your model. And that's what active machine learning is about. And for those who aren't familiar with that discipline, the idea is to give a machine learner the ability to acquire new data on its own, to ask for new data, as opposed to the more traditional passive machine learning, where you have some collection of data, even what may be very large, that you build a model on, and then you're done. The idea here is to be able to tackle problems where the space of possible data is very large and you have none or a very small fraction of it. And so that's where active learning comes in. Now, a particular problem that we can talk about in this context is the problem of drug development, which one of the teams was talking about. The way in which much of drug development occurs, even up to now, is to identify a target that we need a drug for. So that would be a protein or some other part of our bodies that needs to be, that is out of whack, that is behaving in a way it shouldn't. And we need to try to find a drug that will restore it to its normal function, or otherwise prevent it from interfering with normal function. And so what happens is we make an assay for that particular target. So for example, does this cell that is normally affected, that normally crawls, but when there's a defect, it can't crawl properly. So let's make an assay that measures whether or not the cell can crawl if I add different drugs to it. So that's an example. Or we have an enzyme assay where there's a particular enzyme that is broken, and we want to find a drug that will restore its activity. So the way that is done is to take lots and lots of potential drugs, nowadays millions of potential drugs, and do that assay on all of them. So we take our assay system, we add one drug, we measure what the results are, and we keep doing that. And in doing that, what we're looking for is a drug that has the desired effect and as strong a version of the desired effect as possible. So in this case, we have, imagine a very small space of drugs. We would pick this drug as the one that we're going to proceed with, potentially to turn it into a therapy. By the way, I said drugs, but they are, preliminary drugs or compounds, not necessarily drugs until we actually decide that we're going to use them. So we decide we're going to pick that one. The problem is there are lots and lots of other targets in our bodies. There are all of these other things that could be affected by that drug, and we never measure them. We only measure them indirectly by doing toxicity measurements, or in fact, once we've done some, we've eliminated really bad effects like toxic effects, we sometimes don't discover the effects until quite a bit later. And it turns out, of course, that that drug we picked might have effects on other targets, which are side effects, okay? And what ideally we would want when we're trying to pick a drug for a particular problem is to be able to measure all of the potential drugs on all of the targets, and then pick one that doesn't have side effects, or at least doesn't have major side effects, right? But in order to do that, we would have to have measured all the drugs on all the targets, a very, very large space. That's where active learning comes in. And we can think of that as being analogous to playing Battleship. That is, that we have a space of drugs and targets, like the rows and columns in Battleship, and we don't want to play by doing A1, B1, C1. That will take forever and we'll lose. What we want is to search through that space for to collect data that will allow us to predict other parts of that space, such as if we get a hit, we can predict there's a high probability of other hits around that hit. Now, in Battleship, we would immediately use that information to try to sink the ship. But in this active learning framework, what we're going to do is we're just going to say, well, now I have the ability to predict or to estimate the probability of those neighboring places being also active. And so I don't have to necessarily test them. That's the whole key, is to be able to collect some data, enough data that you can build a predictive model where you don't have to do the rest of the experiments. Just like in playing Battleship, you never end up hitting all of the spaces. So here's an example of doing this, where we took data from a very large database called PubChem from the National Library of Medicine that has the results of millions of experiments on different targets, different assays, and different potential drugs, different compounds. We took just a portion of that. And what we did is we played Battleship. We hid the data, and then we had a computer say, well, why don't you show me the results for this compound and this target, and then I'm going to start building my predictive model. And what happens, what happened when we did that is, by the way, the frequency of hits, the things that we're looking for, is very low, less than 0.1%. So if we do that search randomly, we get a very low rate of discovery. So here is what fraction of the data we've revealed, and this is what did we find, the positives that we're looking for. If we do that randomly, it's very, very slow. If we do that by what was the standard approach in drug discovery, which is called QSAR, quantitative structure activity relationship, we can do better than random. But if we use active learning to choose the experiments, we do far better. So we can find almost 60% of the hits in this database by doing only 2.5% of the experiments and then building a predictive model for the rest. So we've also done this where we've actually executed new experiments, not using an existing database, but used new experiments, executed new experiments using laboratory automation, robots. And in that case, we tried a similar problem, which is how do the distribution within cells do the protein distributions within cells change in response to different compounds, different drugs. All right, so we have lots of drugs, lots of compounds. We're trying to, again, learn a predictive model. But in this case, we don't even know in advance what the responses might be. So this is an unsupervised process where we're just going to add drugs to cells, take pictures of them, try to then build a predictive model where we don't even know what the behaviors are in advance. And so when we did that, we were able to build a model that was 92% accurate after doing only 28% of the experiments. And the bigger the space, the more that efficiency tends to go up. So where does that leave us in terms of the where we think the future of biology looks like and other empirical sciences? This automated science paradigm tries to avoid the building an understanding in people because biological systems are too complex for people to understand. There aren't any rules that are simple rules we can learn that would allow us to predict them. And so the automated science paradigm is pick a system to study, identify what kinds of data could I collect, what kinds of experiments could I collect about that system, identify the things that could change, the different proteins, genes, drugs, whatever, that might change the behavior of that system, and then iteratively construct a generative model, a predictive model that predicts behaviors for all of the combinations of the experimental variables. And then from that, use active learning to choose new experiments. And the most frequent way that we use active learning to do that is to pick not the predictions from the model that we have the highest confidence in, but the predictions from the model that we have the lowest confidence in. Those are the ones that will improve the model the most because they are the lowest. And then use laboratory automation to execute them. So that's what we think the future is like, this automated science paradigm. By the way, we have a master's program here at Carnegie Mellon in the automated science. It's the first of its kind in the world. It started in 2018, and we've graduated a number of students who are now out in the automated science community and work in instruments. And I'll stop there because I've run a little bit long. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Great. And thank you so much. And I think this is very informative for the community because, as I mentioned, one of our teams is also working in automated science. And I know that's a little bit different from the main thrust of presentations that we've had in the summer series in generative AI. Are there any questions out in the audience? So if not, I'll ask a question. I am wondering if all of the recent hype in generative AI connects up with what's happening in computational biology, because as those of us who do work in artificial intelligence know, generative AI isn't like a brand new thing. It's been around. There have been, some recent advances, but the main difference in what I have seen is in the scale. And I'm wondering, has computational biology experienced a similar surge to what's happening in the language side?
So it's a great question. Answering a specific version of that question is, how have large language models impacted biology? You can probably guess that my answer is not so much, because they are building off of whatever knowledge there is in literature, and that knowledge is incredibly incomplete, and much of it is just simply wrong. Most of it is actually wrong, and most of it is of a form that says, this gene is the most important thing for this disease, but most diseases, are not. single, or many are not single component, caused by a single component. And so when the experiment has been done is to ask LLMs for, theories for biological processes, it, like in many other cases, just invents stuff. And even if it has captured something specifically from literature, a lot of the time it's wrong. So I think that, the difference between empirical sciences, where the data is tiny compared to the spaces we're dealing with, compared with, for example, information about the world, or, that is well captured in text, that I think that's the difference. So we still need generative approaches. They just need to be a different type than just capturing text.
Yeah, that's a really important message for this community, because I think that the media has given the world the impression that, somehow we've solved all of artificial intelligence, but as we know, that's not true. So thank you so much for this really important message. And now we have our second talk, which is by Ari Lightman. Come on in, Ari. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Go right ahead.
Appreciate it. How much time do I have? Just so
you have 20 minutes altogether.
All right. Thanks everyone for having me. Appreciate it. So Bob's talk was fascinating from a micro perspective. I'm going to be talking about things from a macro perspective, looking at healthcare at a larger scale, and tell you about some of the stuff that we're doing at the Center for Machine Learning and Health, as well as the Center for Innovation in Healthcare. A little bit about myself. I teach over at Hines. I look at the digitization of industries, the digitization of society, and one of my areas that I'm very interested in is healthcare, around its rapid digitization, especially after COVID, looking at acceleration of drug discovery, acceleration of data that's available within the healthcare space from a genomic perspective, a medical information perspective, and those sorts of things. When I was putting this together this morning, I thought about this quote from Walter Cronkite. If you guys don't know who Walter Cronkite is, he was probably one of the most respected and trusted journalists that I think we've ever had. He said this quote on the Charlie Rose show back in 1993. It is as true today as it was back then. So if you look at our healthcare system, especially within the US, it's not a system, it's not very caring. It's actually a patchwork of different systems together. So when we think about things from an AI perspective, in terms of data, we have to understand disparate data sources. We have to understand multimodal data, right? And where does it exist? How do you bring it together? How do you normalize this to really understand patients holistically, to understand patient journeys, to understand capability, to understand efficiency, productivity, you name it. And these are the things, the projects that we are funding at the Center for Machine Learning and Health and the Center for Innovation in Healthcare. I don't mean to be flippant. I see Carolyn laughing. Thank you, Carolyn. But COVID sucked. It just did. We lost loved ones. We lost members of our community. We lost time. We lost productivity. Teaching during COVID sucked. We're seeing tremendous amounts of burnout in the healthcare system because, frankly, we were not ready for this sort of black swan event, right? This sort of crisis that we had because of the previous quote that I just mentioned. We weren't integrated. We weren't ready. We didn't have data that was readily available. We didn't have a resilient system. We didn't have an adaptable system. We didn't have a productive or efficient system. And that is important to understand and assess. And one of the reasons why I think what you guys are doing is so valuable is looking at these things to put together so that we could create more resiliency, more adaptability, more understandability within healthcare. I don't want to be a doomsayer. I don't like being a doomsayer, but we will have another significant pandemic event, right? Whatever COVID 2.0 will occur based on transference from one animal species to another, based on unhealthy, unsafe, crowded conditions, what have you, it will come about and it will suck even more. Unless, frankly, the unless is we get our act together, right? And we get it together very, very quickly. So these are some of the things that I think about, and I know a lot of other people are thinking about. After COVID, one of the things that folks looked at, especially the OECD, was life expectancy. For the first time ever, US life expectancy is now below life expectancy in China. So if you look at the OECD countries in Australia and Canada, where I come from, and New Zealand and France and Germany, and all those sorts of countries, you look at the average, we're 3 to 4 years below average. And when I tell you that we spend the most on healthcare out of any country out there, with some of the lowest sort of results associated with it, that's problematic. That shows you how much inefficiency there is within the system. And it gets worse. So we have a pretty good healthcare. We live in Pittsburgh. Most of you, I'm sure, live in Pittsburgh. We're part of CMU. Whoever your provider is, mine is UPMC. We have a good sort of access and availability when it comes to healthcare. You go 25 to 30 miles south of Pittsburgh, completely different situation. Right? So if we want to think about healthcare from a societal perspective, we need to think about underrepresented minorities and disadvantaged communities, right? Access to care. And a lot of studies that have been out there, which are really fascinating, have shown that people have a lower propensity associated with seeking care, specifically preventative care, when the healthcare community does not represent them. I'm talking about their culture, their values, their language, their history, those sorts of things. So if we don't have enough diversity within the healthcare system, we're going to see people not seeking care as readily as we would like, as we would hope, and not getting the preventative care that they need. And when you don't get preventative care, you see things like this happen, right? Decreases associated with life expectancy. You see people seeking care in the most extreme manner possible, which is going to the emergency room, which, as we know, is the most expensive way to receive care. And waiting that long, the outcomes are not as optimal as we would like, right? So there's a toll associated with mortality. There's also a toll associated with cost around delivery of care. The other thing that we saw associated with COVID, and folks like Kathleen Carley are measuring this and looking at this, we saw, and I spent a lot of time looking at online information. I saw a tremendous spike in medical misinformation. And this is having a societal toll as well, because people are getting information that's not vetted. And so what we could talk about the differences between disinformation, misinformation, malinformation. A lot of the information that was shared, that we saw, we took a look at, was just concerned citizens that might have responded to a study, right? And sent that information out to a variety of different friends, who then sent that information out to their friends. And it almost became de facto standard. However, those results were subsequently disproven. And once they get disproven, as Carolyn knows, it's really hard to walk back information and say, wait a minute, the stuff that you were thinking is fact is now actually not fact. It's very, very difficult to do. So this isn't malicious intent. This is information that was misconstrued, misinterpreted, and unfortunately it comes into the lexicon associated with all the misinformation that is out there. So this is something that we have to pay attention to. We have to take a look at, and we're funding projects to look at this as well. Let's talk a little bit about acceleration associated with digitization. So another thing that COVID did was it exposed all the inequities, the inefficiencies, the lack of productivity within the space. one of the things that we're seeing now an acceleration is hey, let's look at behavioral change, right? Every insurer out there is thinking about how can we change behavioral change. All the fitness providers, we worked with Nike last semester. Before that, we worked with Peloton. They're trying to understand behavioral change and multiple different components to create a healthier society, right? We know that we shouldn't smoke, we shouldn't drink, we should pay attention to the food intake, those sorts of things. But how do we nudge people in a manner that they could understand, that they could process, that they could assess, to make those changes over time so that we're healthier as a society, right? How do we get them to share information, specifically looking at things like potentially genomic information, so that if we want to take population health and reduce it down to precision medicine, or that information becomes invaluable, right? And then how do we get access to that information? I talk about democratizing medicine. We look at availability, accessibility, and affordability associated with key therapeutics that people need around basically keeping alive, right? You're a diabetic, you have to have access to insulin, right? These sorts of things are critical, right? We worked with one of the largest pharmaceutical providers on one of the drugs that they have for MS patients, looking at all these three categories in terms of how do people perceive them, not just cost, but where do they get access, right? We think about access to things and stuff from a retail perspective. I could go down to the store, I could get it delivered to my house, I could have somebody pick it up and deliver it to me. How do we access medicine? Well, I go to the CVS on Wilkins, right? That's my de facto place to get it. But can there be a variety of different mechanisms that might get me the life-saving medications that I need in a framework that I could understand, assess, look at the administration, the monitoring, the dosage, those sorts of things. And we're seeing all kinds of changes in the system associated with this. And the last is really around this idea of efficacy, quality, and research. When I think about AI in the healthcare space, and I don't want to get on my soapbox, folks, but I've seen some really, really cool stuff. And I'm like, that sounds fantastic. We need to do that. But when you look at healthcare, if we don't solve the underlying issue with healthcare, we're not going to adopt any of the cool AI-generated models within healthcare, because it is right now, it's block and tackling. It's table stakes. It's looking at how do we create greater levels of operational capacity within healthcare, right? We have to understand patient rounding, physician routing, all of those sorts of things, so people can go into the system, get seen, get checked out, get help, look at preventative screens and a variety of other things while they're in the healthcare setting, and then leave as quickly as possible to free up capacity in beds and those sorts of things. And we learned this the hard way during COVID, in terms of everything from PPE to intubation machines, to ventilators, to a variety of different things. We didn't have enough capacity, and we didn't know where capacity is. And when you don't have that, people die, right? So when we look at the one thing that I think COVID did was not only exposed what the inefficiencies within the system, but also said, if we need to move forward in protecting society from the next pandemic, we need to do this, this, and this, right? So there's a variety of different efforts going on across different institutions like CMU. We've had lots of conversations with Applied AI Center at University of Chicago. There's a wonderful center at Johns Hopkins looking at these things, but all of these sorts of things are now coming up, right? Different types of diagnosis. So if you remember early on in COVID, there was only a couple of different types of tests associated with looking for. Now there are dozens of different types, cough detections, pattern recognition, a variety of different things where we could understand the earliest onset of this specific disease state, right? Bob talked a little bit about drug development. The acceleration of the fact that we got a vaccine to market in the time that we did is frankly incredible. When you think about reducing all the barriers to drug development and vaccine development, yes, it was shaky. It was unstable. It had to be flash frozen and gotten to the market quickly, but we got it to the market. So this, to me, it emulates this idea where there's a need and a will, there is a way. And we need to think about innovation in the healthcare system and reducing some of the mitigations and some of the barriers and some of the risks associated with getting things to market as quickly as possible, whether it's an application, whether it's a platform, or whether it's a drug, right? Vetted information. So a variety of different folks are looking at this mechanism of creating reputable, understandable, and vetted medical information to the public. Right? And the last thing that I wanted to mention, which I think is really interesting, is remember when we had a social distance from everybody? Everybody had to be 6 feet apart, right? Which is fine by me. I've spent my whole life being socially distant, so I was cool. But this idea of understanding where people are, which I've seen multiple different times from the retail space around people coming in, how far apart are they? How do they go across various different aisles? What are they reaching for? What are they gazing for? All of this information we can understand, we can assess, we can analyze. And this is incredibly important because if you remember during COVID, there was asymptomatic spread, healthcare-borne infections. And we needed to keep people apart in order to prevent this. Right? So how do we have flow patterns, especially within healthcare settings where people are coming in for care? How do we look at flow information around specific groups to make sure that they are kept safe, right? Within a healthcare-based setting. The other thing that I think is fascinating is, once again, right now, I am building a database of medical information. It's super hard to get. We're seeing a little bit more opening up from healthcare centers associated with providing information that we need to do the research. But then we have companies like Apple say, this is ridiculous. And UPMC opens up their data to us, which is great. I go to my UPMC, see my charts, see a variety of information. Frankly, the information as it's presented to me is really in a language that I cannot really understand. I can see a bunch of charts. Where's my sort of lipid level, those sorts of things associated with tests. I can see a variety of things that maybe my orthopedist talked about when I had my ACL surgery. I can't understand it. I can't digest it. Apple's like, you should be able to interact it. And with things like fast healthcare interoperability resource, now I can download all my information and interact with it. The big question is, once you interact with your data, is it valid healthcare information now? Right? I'm not a clinician, I'm not a physician, but I've just put information into something that I created around my personal health information. Is that something that the medical institution can utilize? I talked about this. I just want to be very cautious of time. One of the things that I think is fascinating is all the patient communities that are out there. So we have people with specific condition sets going onto these patient communities and talking about their condition, the drugs they take, their healthcare institution, their regimen, what exacerbates their condition, what mitigates their condition, all of these sorts of things. I think it's fascinating information. But it's kind of, once again, it's blocked from the medical community, right? They talk in a specific way. The patients who are suffering from these conditions talk in a specific way. These things need to be organized together for better communication patterns. And believe it or not, this is something I've actually done. So this is work that I did with MITRE 10 years ago around looking at diabetes patients and looking at the care community, whether it's rheumatologists, whether it's endocrinologists, whomever, talking about diabetes, they spoke different languages about the same things, different terminology. So we built dictionaries and ontologies on top of this. So Carolyn asked about generative AI. This is exactly where generative AI can help in terms of improving communication between physicians and patients, between physicians and caregivers, all across the board. It can help out tremendously in terms of understanding how people process information, how they assess information, understanding their own particular cultural background, right? And providing them information that's more resonant. So these are projects that we're funding at the Center for Machine Learning and Health. Center for Machine Learning and Health is a UPMC funded center. We've been around since 2016. I've been with the center since inception. We funded 30 different projects, probably about 60 different PhD fellowships, spun out about 4 or 5 different companies out of it. The Center for Innovation Healthcare is relatively new. And the idea here is to look at an ecosystem approach to healthcare, right? Not just one funder and sort of one sole partner within a healthcare ecosystem, but look at multiple different pharmaceutical companies, technology companies, medical equipment providers, all of those sorts of things, pharmaceutical companies contributing to understanding and assessing holistic care and looking across the board. So we're looking at things from sensor derived information. We're looking at tumor morphologies and shape grammars. We're looking at image structures, digital pathology and digital radiology. We're looking at healthcare equity, right? We're looking at communication patterns online, mental health issues. All those sorts of things are all part of the center. But where we're starting, our first initial grant was around patient safety and medication errors. I'll just talk about really quickly. This is a huge area, and I'm really excited that we're sort of taking an active role in looking at this. I'm building out a database of some of it's centralized, some of it's like a federated, a data directory. But the idea is combining data together, medical information, data from pharmacy-based information, even looking at genomic information associated with biomarkers to understand and assess why do medication errors occur and how might we prevent them in the future. It is a big, large, hairy issue. And it gets more complicated as you get further away from the hospital, from the healthcare institution, right? So there's checks and balances within the hospital setting, but medication errors still occur, leading to adverse drug events. As you go to transitions of care, you see an escalation associated with medication errors. As you go to a home-based environment, ambulatory environment, health in a home-based setting, explosion. Why? Well, frankly, we see cognitive dissonance. We see cognitive decline, right? So in an elderly population with comorbidity, polypharmacy patients, we see an explosion of medication errors. So we have groups that are high probability risk categories. We have drugs that we know of, like prednisone and heparin, which are high probability drug categories. And then we have procedures that are high probability procedures. We can model all of this, assess it, and come up with mechanisms associated with mitigation. So we're funding research. We're looking at things like omissions and commissions associated with medication errors. So overprescribing and underprescribing. We're looking at chemical on chemical interactions, a variety of different things, but we're really excited about this space and we're just starting right now.
So thank you so much. We're almost completely out of time, but there is a question in the chat. So we will give you one question, and that is, how complicated is it to build out patient and information controls given HIPAA and GDPR? I'm guessing that you need a completely standalone model and infrastructure.
Absolutely. It is really tough. So we've looked at a couple of different proposals associated with how do we create a control and command center, right? That physicians can go to associated with, is there a potential around adverse event modeling, those sorts of things. I think one of the things that's really fascinating is the explosion of synthetic data in the medical space. So we could actually emulate various different types of data forms, databases, those sorts of things. If we want to create, and one of the big efforts around this is this creation of digital twins, especially in a healthcare environment, right? So we can model all of these different processes, all of these different communities, all these different needs, and do simulations associated with it, which is direly needed within the space. So the long and short of it, it's very difficult, but there's really innovative ways associated with building out what is needed to create these command centers.
Great. Okay. Well, these talks, I think, have been extremely valuable for putting the work of this hackathon in context. They really give a very realistic edge to the whole thing, not allowing us to think that any one technological advance really has the power to solve the whole problem. It's in the context of a whole system where there are many considerations, and also that we need to consider the limitations of what can be achieved with technology, depending upon what data is readily available, and not to just take, a very blunt view of all of this. So thank you so much, both of you, Bob and Ari, for your talks. Thank you to the teams for presenting their work in progress. And I hope that everyone will come to tomorrow's judging event. And again, if you look at the email with the link to this session, there was a separate link to the session for tomorrow. So hope to see many of you there, and have a good day. Enjoy your Saturday.